This is the OHSU Effect Inside Health and Science at OHSU. Thanks for being with us today. I'm your host, Lacey Evans. Lots of things to talk about today and more great doctors joining us from up on the hill. But first, we're going to talk about aging and Alzheimer's, a very scary disease. In fact, a new international survey reveals that many people view Alzheimer's disease as a major health threat, fearing it as much as they do cancer. With us now on the OHSU Effect is Dr. Joseph Quinn, a researcher at the Latent Aging and Alzheimer's Disease Center. Thanks for being with us, Doctor.
Thanks for having me.
So according to that article that I mentioned, people are very concerned about Alzheimer's. Are you surprised by the results of that poll?
I'm not surprised at all. Yeah, and I think what's behind it is the fact that Alzheimer's disease is becoming much more common as the population ages. And people are much more frequently personally affected by the disease. You know, when I meet people, they always tell me about a mother or parent or grandparent or somebody who's been affected. So it's really touching a lot more people than it did 50 years ago.
So what does this say about Americans and our health concerns? I mean, where our priorities are, I guess.
Well, I think you might interpret that people are more concerned about quality of life than about duration of life. That's one way to maybe interpret it. That with Alzheimer's disease, even though the lifespan is shortened, it's really the quality, the change in the quality of life that's most disturbing. And people, value their cognitive abilities and their ability to remain independent. And I think they're recognizing that is threatened more and more by something like Alzheimer's disease.
A lot of recent research has focused on the difficulties of diagnosing Alzheimer's. So how is this done currently?
Well, at present, we don't have a blood test or a brain scan or a way to confirm a diagnosis. So the diagnosis is made by a physician who gathers all the information together and really exercises their judgment. So the information they gather together is the history of the problem, the physical examination, which includes an examination of mental function. And then the tests that we do right now are really focused on making sure we're not dealing with something other than Alzheimer's disease. So there's blood tests and there's brain scans, but none of those allow us to confirm the diagnosis. We're focused on excluding other treatable things. So it really comes down to the judgment of the doctor at the end of the day.
Do you think that will change in the future? Could there be brain scans that show this?
Yeah, there's something on the horizon that is potentially going to change things dramatically. So you may have heard, and your listeners may have heard, of the idea that there are plaques in the brain of patients with Alzheimer's disease. And those plaques are composed of something called amyloid. At present, none of our scans allow us to see the amyloid. But there's a scan that's currently under review by the FDA and is likely to be approved very soon that does allow us to see the amyloid, and that will ultimately become available. So that's going to be potentially a big change in the way we do things in the very near future.
What do we currently know about the causes of Alzheimer's?
Well, we know a lot about things that influence the risk of having Alzheimer's disease, and we call them risk factors. That doesn't mean that they cause the disease. It just means that they're present more frequently in people who have the disease than in people of the same age who are spared the disease. So the risk factors include some familiar things like high blood pressure and diabetes and high cholesterol are all risk factors. A head injury, which is sufficient enough to actually render somebody unconscious, is also a risk factor for the disease. Use of certain medications can be a risk factor for the disease. Low education is a risk factor for the disease. So there are a number of these risk factors that have been defined, but what we're struggling with is really understanding how those risks actually influence the onset of the disease, and if there's something that we can do to modify those risk factors in a constructive way.
Is there a genetic component here?
Yeah, there is. So I was telling you about the risk factors that are non-genetic, but there are also genetic risk factors. And as with the non-genetic risk factors, most of the genetic risk factors are really not causative. They sort of shift the risk one way or the other. So to give you an example, the one that's most common and that's most powerful in late onset typical Alzheimer's disease is a gene that's abbreviated as ApoE. And the high-risk gene is present in only about 15 to 20% of the general population, but it's present in 50 to 60% of people with Alzheimer's disease. So it's overrepresented in Alzheimer's disease, and that finding has been reproduced many times over. But as you can tell from the numbers I just gave you, that means almost half the people with Alzheimer's disease don't have that gene. And it's possible to have the gene and not get the disease. So it's a very complicated scenario. We know genes are important, but it's not as simple as you have a gene, you get the disease.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it sounds like there are still a lot of unknowns in the research of Alzheimer's.
There are, and there's really been a lot of productivity in the last 20 years. We've really learned a great deal about these plaques in the brain. We've learned a great deal about ApoE. We've learned how to image the amyloid and to do some of these other things. But we don't have the answers we need to a lot of the key questions.
What about prevention? Is there anything a person can do to keep their brain healthy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, according to the National Institute of Health, the answer is no. So the NIH had a national consensus conference about a year ago. They invited experts from all over the country to give testimony about how to prevent Alzheimer's disease. They had a separate panel of experts review the testimony and give their conclusions about what they heard. And this was really a big deal. This was a couple of days planned, a year in advance, and a lot of incredible information was presented. But the panel concluded that none of the evidence was compelling that there's a specific way to prevent Alzheimer's disease. So that was kind of disappointing to a lot of us. Now, we do know that addressing a lot of these risk factors that I've mentioned are good for you anyway. So I think most of us, when we see people who are at risk of Alzheimer's disease by virtue of family history or what have you, we really encourage them to pay a lot of attention to the things that are good for their heart, to make sure your blood pressure's under control, your blood sugar, your cholesterol, make sure you're getting aerobic exercise. And while it's true, as the NIH says, I can't prove that treating those things is going to prevent Alzheimer's disease, they're definitely good for you. So that's what we really push our patients to do. Absolutely.
Well, looking towards the future, what do you think about a treatment? Is one on the horizon?
Yeah, so there are a number of treatment strategies that are in late-stage clinical trials, meaning the preliminary trials have proven them to be safe and have given some inkling of efficacy. And I do think that in the next 10 or 20 years, one of these approaches is going to show significant benefits. Now, that doesn't mean, I don't think that people who are already very, very impaired by the disease are going to be able to be restored. But I think there's realistic hope that within our lifetime, we're going to start recognizing the disease earlier, intervening earlier, and really significantly improving the outcomes with that kind of intervention.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I've seen advertisements on TV for a medication that can maybe lessen the symptoms. It's not a treatment or a cure by any means. Is that true?
Yeah, so there are 4 drugs that are approved by the FDA for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And to get approved by the FDA, you have to pass a pretty high bar. So we all think, or most of us think, that this is a good thing, but the drugs really have very modest effects. And they sort of treat the tip of the iceberg. They treat the symptoms, as you said. And what we're after with these other therapies are something that really treats the fundamental aspect of the disease to prevent it from progressing any further. And I think, as I say, that there really is some very real potential that we'll have some success there.
Well, I want to talk about the Leighton Alzheimer's Center and the services it provides. What are you guys doing up there?
Yeah, so the Leighton Center is the Alzheimer's Center at OHSU. And we have 3 missions there. So the first one is clinical care. So we see patients, for regular consultations. We see people for ongoing care who have memory disorders and related conditions. So that's our clinical care component. The second component is the education component. So there are a group of individuals who are charged with providing education about Alzheimer's disease and related conditions to patients and to healthcare professionals. So that's another mission that occurs on an ongoing basis. And then the third one, which is really a very important mission, is the research mission. So we collect a lot of detailed information about the patients that we see over time who consent to participate in research. We've contributed to some of these studies to try to develop new methods of developing brain scans and blood tests and other tests to make the diagnosis. And then, most importantly, we're involved in development of new treatments along the lines that we were just describing.
And we just have a few seconds left, but I want you to give information if people are interested in participating.
Yeah, so if people are interested in participating in clinical trials, we are especially interested right now in people with early Alzheimer's disease. And the phone number that they can call is 503-494-9399. and their information will be taken down, and we'll try to steer them towards studies that they may be interested in.
Great. Dr. Quinn, thank you. That's the OHSU effect on KXL. More coming up.